For our first lecture, we're going to discuss how psychology is a science. We'll go over some of the methods used in psychological science, the ethics behind it, and some important statistical information. This is a nice intro to the topic of psychology because it allows you all to get a basic understanding of the type of work that goes into psychological research and how we come to the conclusion that certain psychological phenomenon exist. Since this is an intro to psych course, we won't get into the nuances of psychological research. That'll come when you take research methods later on down the line if you choose to become a psych major. My biggest hope for this course is that you all leave with an understanding that psychology is a science and that we use the scientific method to make conclusions about different phenomenon. I also hope that learning about research and psychology will help you develop better critical thinking skills. So, without further ado, let's get started. The scientific method is something that you're hopefully all familiar with. Most of us learn about it for the first time when we're in elementary school. The basic premise of the scientific method is that we observe something in the world that helps us formulate a question. Once we have that question, we then try to hypothesize what the answer to that question might be. And then we conduct some sort of experiment to test our hypothesis. Once we've collected data through an experiment, we then analyze it so we can discover what our data means. And this leads us to develop a conclusion. Then the cycle is meant to repeat itself as new questions form. And now that's the scientific method at its most basic form. When you think about it, it feels like a relatively simple method that shouldn't take that long to cycle through. The reality is that the scientific method is much more complex and detailed than this diagram depicts. So it's actually a really rigorous process. When we conduct psychological research using the scientific method, we start off with a theory. And so a theory is something that explains behaviors or events by offering ideas that organize observations. So a theory helps us summarize and simplify ideas. And any good theory will produce testable predictions, which we call hypotheses. We then develop an experiment that's going to test that theory. However, we have to consider a ton of different factors when we design our experiment. For example, we have to think about how the results of the experiment will translate to the real world. So if our experiment is conducted in a lab, sometimes people might behave a little bit differently than they would out with their friends or at work. We also might have to think about certain resources. Like, do we have the funds available so that we can purchase the best equipment and use the best methodology? Can we even ethically study the question that we're seeking to answer? So once a scientist has designed their experiment and collected their data, then they have to analyze it. And we won't go into the nitty-gritty here, but there are a ton of analyses that researchers can use. They have to choose the best one, and they need to make sure that they analyze their data correctly so they don't make a mistake and report incorrect findings. Lastly, you would think the conclusion step would be fairly simple, but there's a lot of work put into developing a conclusion. So once a scientist has determined what their findings mean, they then need to start thinking about what future directions their research might take. By conducting an experiment, they may uncover new questions or want to test their theory in different conditions. Additionally, their experiment will need to be replicated by others so that we can conclude that their findings are consistent in various populations when others are conducting their research. For this reason, researchers have to use operational definitions in their research. So this means that they carefully word the procedure of their study. For example, for my thesis, I had to make sure that I had an operational definition for well-being so that the future researchers know what I meant when I said that I was measuring that. So the scientific method may seem like a tedious process at times, but it's absolutely essential so that we can conduct good psychological research. Psychologists observe the world in many different ways. One way is through case studies. So in a case study, we examine one individual or a group in depth in hope of revealing things that are true of us all. So we might use case studies to observe things that would otherwise be unethical for us to conduct experiments on. For instance, a lot of case studies within psychology, they focus on patients with brain damage. So it would be horribly unethical for us to damage a specific part of a person's brain just to see the consequences. But if a person receives the TBI, we can recruit them for a study to see how they differ from someone who doesn't have brain damage. Probably one of the most well-known case studies within psychology is that of Phineas Gage. And Gage survived a traumatic accident where a railroad rod impaled his frontal lobe. So because of this incident, we have a better understanding of how damage to the frontal lobe affects a person's behavior, but we'll discuss him in more detail at a different time. Case studies can provide us with direction for future studies, but they do have their limits. For one, they can be kind of misleading. So sometimes the subject of our case study can be atypical, and they might not be a good representation of certain phenomenon. For instance, we know that smoking decreases our longevity, but if a researcher decides to conduct a case study on smokers and recruits a participant who smokes 2 packs a day but is 98, there might not be a good representation of the group. Another issue is that a case study doesn't explain behavior. Since we're just observing the person and we didn't do anything to manipulate their behavior, we can't conclude what causes their behavior. We can also employ the use of naturalistic observation, and this is when we observe and record behavior in the subject's natural environment. So when we employ naturalistic observation, we attempt to observe without manipulating or controlling the situation. It's basically the opposite of what you would do in a research lab. A classic example of naturalistic observation would be observing how children interact with each other on the playground. It's fairly normal for parents and guardians to watch their kids play from the bench. So this is a great situation where children would be unlikely to change their behavior due to a person observing them. Now with technology, we can do some really cool naturalistic observation over the web. So one of my favorite studies that employed the naturalistic observation looked at language that people used on Twitter to predict their likelihood of heart disease. So this study found that those who use negative words on Twitter were more likely to live in counties with higher rates of heart disease. So even more impressive is that language was a better predictor of heart disease than typical predictors like smoking and obesity. So naturalistic observation can provide us with some really neat information. The downside to naturalistic observation is that, once again, it describes behavior, but it doesn't explain it. Surveys are one of the most common ways that psychologists collect data. With surveys, people report their own attitudes or behaviors. They allow us to collect a lot of data from a large sample and pull interesting information from that data. Surveys also have some drawbacks, though. People may respond in socially desirable ways instead of reporting the truth. You also have to be very careful about how you word questions, since this can influence the way that participants respond. We also strive to get what's called a representative sample, which is something you'll hear a lot regarding psychological research. A representative sample should consist of a random sample, meaning anyone within the entire population of a group that you're sampling from has an equal chance of being included in the study. If the sample from a survey is a representative sample, then we can generalize that data to the entire population. When we want to study what causes a phenomenon to happen, we use experiments. So when psychologists use experiments, they allow researchers to isolate the effects of one or more factors by manipulating the factor that they're interested in. while controlling for other factors. So when a researcher conducts a study, they often have an experimental group, which is the group that receives the experimental manipulation. So let's say that I want to conduct a study to determine if a new pill helps students with their recall. For my experimental group, they will take the pill 30 minutes before they view a lecture and then take a subsequent test. To verify that the pill actually works, I need to complete the same study, but with a sample of students who don't receive the manipulation or the pill. This group would instead receive a sugar pill, also known as a placebo, so that the procedure they experience is the same as the one in the experimental group. This sugar pill group would be the control group. To try to ensure that the two groups are as similar to each other as possible, I would use a technique called random assignment. So as the name states, this is when we randomly assign participants to the two groups. In this example, the participants in this study are all blind to the condition that they're in. This means that they don't know whether they took the actual pill or the sugar pill. To be extra cautious and make sure that I'm not influencing the participants, I might decide to use a double-blind procedure. So in this procedure, both I and the participants wouldn't know what condition the participants are in. So this is a really nice tactic to use because sometimes researchers really want their hypothesis to be correct, or they really believe in their methods. So they might treat the experimental group a little differently than the control group, which can skew the results. We want to conduct good science, so a double-blind procedure helps us reduce investigator effects. So I've been referring to the sugar pill used in this study as a placebo. We want to use a placebo because, again, we want to keep the procedure as similar as possible between groups. However, we also want to do this because of the placebo effect. So the placebo effect is when we experience results because we believe that something will happen. So just thinking that we're getting a treatment can affect us. And because of this, it wouldn't be surprising if we see that the control group has improved recall compared to their baseline recall. The last thing I want to touch on is variables. So in every experiment, we have to have at least one independent variable and one dependent variable. The independent variable is the thing that we're manipulating. It's the condition that participants get put into, so either a group that receives a pill or a group that receives a placebo. The dependent variable is what we measure after our participants are introduced to the independent variable. So the dependent variable is what we're interested in observing. So for our study, the dependent variable would be the recall score that our participants get when they take the test after the lecture they viewed. We can also have something called confounding variables, and these are factors that can influence the results of the study. So ideally, random assignment controls for confounding variables, but sometimes we still wind up with these variables. So for our experiment, a confounding variable may be that 20% of the people in our experimental group just had a lecture on the same material that we'll be presenting them with. So of course, these individuals will score better than the control group because they've had more exposure to the topic. Psychologists conduct research on both animals and humans, but in order to do so, they need to have a firm understanding regarding the ethics behind this type of research. So when it comes to animal research, many psychologists choose to use animals because they're fascinating. They want to understand how humans and animals differ from one another, but they also study animals because they're very similar to us, especially regarding biology. Because of animal research, we've been able to develop vaccines, learn about organ transplants, and uncover treatments for diseases. When psychologists use animals for research, they're held to a very high standard that they have to abide by. These psychologists receive special training before they can work with animals. The welfare of the animals is a top priority. They're required to receive housing that is as close to their natural habitat as possible, companions, and enrichment. So here at ISU, we have some psychologists who conduct animal research, and you can tell that they genuinely care for their critters. For human research, we have a few ethics that we have to follow. Participants must receive informed consent before they can participate in research. So this is where they are explained the premise of the study, and any potential harmful effects of the study are explained. So participants also must be protected from greater than usual harm. So in the past, there were some just truly awful experiments that were conducted on humans. Experiments like the Tuskegee syphilis study or the Stanford prison experiment. Now, research has to go through an ethics review board before it can be approved and conducted, which has really helped improve the quality of our studies and the ethics behind them. Researchers also have to let participants know that all of their data and information will remain confidential. Participants must also be debriefed once the study concludes so that they fully understand the purpose of the study and any deception that was used in that study can be explained. Okay, now on to everyone's favorite subject, stats. Okay, so maybe it isn't your favorite subject, but I'll try to make it as painless as possible. So in psychology, we use statistics to help us describe our data. Common stats that we use include measures of central tendency, such as mean, median, and mode. As a quick review, the mean is the average, the median is the number in the middle, or the 50th percentile, and the mode is the number that occurs the most. So these descriptive statistics nicely summarize our data. We also like to measure the variation in our data. For this, we use the range and standard deviation. So the range is the gap between the lowest and the highest scores. And the standard deviation measures how much scores vary around the mean. So if you look at the diagram on this slide, it depicts what we would call a normal curve. And this describes the distribution of data that we see in many data sets. So we see that most of the data falls around the middle, which is the peak, and also where it says 0, with less data on either side. So it might help to think about this using an example. Think about IQ. We would expect most people to score an average IQ score, with fewer people getting really high scores and really low scores. So this normal curve also helps us to understand standard deviations. As you can see on the graph, the x-axis shows numbers -3 through 3. With normal data, we would expect that 13.6% of our data would fall within one standard deviation of the mean, so that dark blue part. Let's finish off this lecture by talking about two questions that your textbook poses. So the first one is, when is an observed difference reliable? So a researcher just finished collecting and analyzing their data, and they found some really cool data and are excited to share it with people. If they meet the following criteria, then their data should be reliable and should be okay to generalize to the population. So the first criteria is that they have a representative sample. We want data that comes from a sample that represents the population that we want to generalize to. If the data is not representative, then it isn't reliable. The second criteria is that there is low variability in the sample. We want average to come from data that doesn't vary as a whole. We want a normal distribution. The third criteria is that we have a large number of cases. So when researchers conduct studies, they need a lot of participants. For example, when I conducted my thesis, I had to have over 170 participants to be able to say that I had a sufficient sample size. If I had stopped collecting data after 20 participants, I wouldn't be able to generalize my findings because 20 would not be a sufficient enough number to find a representative average. The next question that your book asks is, when is an observed difference significant? In psychology, you'll frequently hear the term significant difference or statistically significant. When something is significantly different, it means that it's unlikely the result of our study occurred by chance. So usually researchers set the chance to either 1% or 5%. So if something is statistically significant, it means that there is only a 5% chance that these results occurred due to chance and not because of the phenomenon being measured. However, even though something is statistically significant, it may not have any practical significance. So that's where critical thinking comes into play. You have to decide if it's practically significant or not.